It's past time for us to begin. I'm James Hiles, rector of St. Paul's, and first I want to welcome all of you who have come, and a special welcome to our main speaker, Rod Dreher. 60 years long I have been a priest, and I could never have imagined what the state of the church would be at this time when I started. Things in the church have been so overwhelmed by a rising flow of secularism that the church is hardly any longer what we once thought it would be. And last Lent, 2018, we used Rod Dreher's book for a Lenten discussion. And as I read the book, the scales fell from my eyes as to what really was behind the sad state of affairs in the church and the state of absolute bewilderment among those who continue to remain faithful. And at that time, I decided that we needed to have this voice and this person here to speak to our people and as many others as we could interest in coming. So Rod Dreher responded after considerable effort to reach him. I managed to get through, and he said yes immediately. So it took a while for us to put it all together, and it's a year later than originally thought. But here we are for the festival of St. Michael and All Angels to remember the war in heaven and how that war in heaven between Michael and all the angels was a image, a picture, a foretaste of the war that will be on earth for the church. Rod Dreher.
Thank you. Thank you, Bishop Hiles, for that generous introduction and for welcoming me to your parish. It is really important for us to gather here on this feast of, the eve of the feast of St. Michael the Archangel. I was reminded just last week in New York City, I was in town for some business and went to visit some friends, and I was reminded of how important spiritual warfare is. My friends are people that my wife and I knew pretty well from when we used to live in New York from '98 to 2003. And they were and are very faithful Catholics. But the wife of the couple is possessed by demons. And she's been under the care. This only came out 2 years ago when a priest did healing prayer over her, and they manifested. This is a well-to-do New York couple. You know, the last people you would think would be affected by the enemy in this way, but they are, and she is, and she will be, hopefully, as soon as the cardinal gives his blessing to the rite of exorcism, she will have a full ritual exorcism. But until then, for the past year or so, she's been under the care of the exorcist who's been doing deliverance prayers. And I went to visit them, this couple, when I was in New York, and the husband told me, he said, you know, if you had told me 2 years ago that this is where we would be as a couple, I wouldn't have believed you and I would have run screaming the other way. But this is what we have stumbled into. And it all has to do with ancestral occultism that has been passed down through the family. But my friend, the husband, said, you know, once you've gone down this and once you've seen how real spiritual warfare is, you know that you can't unsee it, and you know that what the real stakes are in the everyday battles that we all fight as Christians. And my friend told me, the husband told me, that he sees what's happening in his own church, the Catholic Church, as being primarily a spiritual battle between demons and angels. He is he works in finance, so this is not the sort of airy-fairy New Age guy at all, but he's a very, very serious Catholic. And he has talked about how all Christians, not just Catholics, all Christians have to get very serious about seeing what's right in front of us, the stakes of the battle we're in, and the nature of the battle we're in. So I hope today my Benedict Option talk will, I offer to you in that context. I'm not going to talk much about spiritual warfare in my speech itself, but I offer all of these things in that context. And we can talk about it in the Q&A later if you like. Well, again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming to the Festival of Faith, and I strongly believe that the things we will discuss here today over the course of the day are vital to the future of Christianity. Let me say from the beginning that I freely confess that I don't have all the answers for us, but I believe I'm asking the right questions, and I'm eager to hear what my fellow speakers this afternoon will have to say, so that I can deepen my own understanding of the crisis, my own response to it from a position of faith, and to understand better what our Lord may be calling us to do in the face of it. Well, first let me tell you what the Benedict Option is and is not. My book, The Benedict Option, was published in the spring of 2017 on the Feast of St. Benedict in the Orthodox Church, and is now available in 11 languages. David Brooks of the New York Times called it the most important religious book of the decade. I don't know about that, but I definitely agree that the issue I take up in the book, the survival of Christianity in the post-Christian West, is the most critical one facing all of us believers. I'm speaking to you this afternoon as a small O Orthodox Christian. Yes, I am an Eastern Orthodox Christian, but I did not write this book from a confessional perspective. I wrote it for all Christians, all my Christian brothers and sisters who profess Christianity and what the Protestant scholar Hans Boersma calls the Great Tradition. Well, what does this mean? It means that I'm speaking to Catholics, Protestants, and Orthodox Christians who, despite our differences, share the belief that Christian truth is transcendent and objective. That we differ on the sources of authoritative truth on matters of faith and morals, we share the conviction that we Christians can't make it up as we go along to suit our individual preferences and the prejudices of this time and place. This is why traditional Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox often find it easier to talk to traditional believers in our own church, traditional believers of other confessions, than we do to progressives in our own churches. We have all experienced this historically unique, I believe, phenomenon. In this endless culture war, all of us who adhere to some form of what has been called mere orthodoxy are in the same foxhole. We need each other. These are not normal times. We in the West are in the worst spiritual and social crisis since the collapse of the Roman Empire. We don't see this collapse clearly because it has been hidden by our wealth and our technological capabilities. But make no mistake, the fundamental pillars of Western civilization are crumbling in front of our eyes, and none more consequentially than the Christian church. Our crisis is actually a combination of several closely related crises. First, it is a crisis of meaning. In the postmodern West, we have arrived at a place where many people no longer believe that truth, and therefore meaning, exists at all, and that we can know it. The modern historian Yuval Noah Harari says that the modern world can be explained and characterized by a simple transaction. People have exchanged meaning for power. That is, to gain the right to do whatever we want with our bodies and with nature, we surrender the idea that objective meaning exists. We are free to do whatever we like, but the cost of that freedom is de facto nihilism. This summer, a Polish historian told me that our situation is like a kite. A kite can soar high in the sky if it is tethered to the ground by a string. But if that string breaks, the kite will plummet to its destruction. That string is a metaphor for our collective relationship to God and to the grounding that we have in the transcendent realm. Our civilization, though, has cut that string, thinking that we're like a slave cutting his shackles. But in fact, this is going to lead to our destruction. So that's one of the crises. Our situation is also a crisis of fragmentation. In our time, we have lost collectively the ability to determine what is true and what is false. We can no longer agree on a narrative that allows us to reason together. This is one reason why we can't resolve our conflicts in the public square. The 19th, 20th, and now the 21st centuries marked a collapse of the grand narratives. The 20th century ended the plausibility of the grand narrative of Marxism as a story that gives us meaning and purpose. The 21st century has ended the grand narrative of liberal democracy and capitalism as the ultimate utopian end of mankind, and the compelling story around which the whole world should organize its life. But for us Christians, the decline of the grand narratives began earlier in the 19th century, when people began to seriously question Christianity as a shared story that explains who we are as a people and what we are to do. It began to fall apart then. It took ordinary believers a very long time, not till the 20th century, to recognize this, but the Christian poet T.S. Eliot, writing in England in the 1930s, was already referring to the West as post-Christian. In the United States, we defied for decades the de-Christianization that Europe was suffering. But we now know through social science research that in the early 1990s, the bottom fell out for us. The US is now on the same steep downward trajectory to atheism that Europe has been on for decades. The sociologist Philip Rieff has written that a civilization begins to collapse when the people within it find it impossible to pass on its values to the younger generations. That process begins when the elites no longer believe in the constitutive values of the civilization. We in America have long since reached that mark. The documented collapse of belief among the generation, as I said, began to come of age in the 1990s. And that is a sign to us. It's a sign of the times. Because we lack a grand shared narrative, people today no longer feel that we're part of a wider community, that despite our differences is essentially united. Radical individualism is the new normal. The old bonds of family and community have mostly dissolved. Our societies are disintegrating, and nobody knows how to stop it. We're also living through a crisis of identity, both individual and societal. We have cut ourselves off from God, from our past, from family, from our places, from traditions, and from any of the traditional sources of the self. We don't know who we are, but we are firmly convinced that we must be self-chosen, self-defined. That's the narrative in America today. Today, in the name of freedom and autonomy, we even deny our biology as males and females. Now, the church ought to offer a compelling alternative to a world that has lost its story. Unfortunately, too many of our churches in this country have also lost their story. We have tried as a Christian community too hard to make the faith relevant to the post-Christian world by reimagining and re-articulating our story in terms that make sense to this consumerist, individualist world. That is, to a world where people don't want to hear hard teachings that save souls, but rather expect religion to do nothing more than to comfort them. You might say that we have traded our birthright, the gospel, for a pot of message. The collapse of the Christian faith is a matter of both quality and quantity. Well, what do I mean by quality? Christian Smith of the University of Notre Dame is one of the nation's top sociologists of religion. He's best known for identifying what he calls the de facto religion of young Americans. He calls this moralistic therapeutic deism, or MTD. MTD is a false religion that has taken over every major faith tradition in the United States. MTD is simple. It preaches these basic premises. 1, God exists. 2, he wants us to be happy and successful in life. 3, he wants us to be nice and to get along with others. 4, we don't really need to call on God to be involved in our lives unless we need something. And finally, if hell exists, then only really, really bad people like Hitler go there. And that's about it. This is not necessarily a bad religion. I would rather live under MTD than radical Islam, but it's not Christianity. It is a form of religion that does not call us to conversion and to holiness, but rather to nothing more than feeling good about ourselves and being polite. The self, not the Bible, not the church, is the ultimate moral and theological authority in MTD. Christian Smith and his research team has found that whatever faith Americans profess with their mouths, in their hearts and in their practices, what they really believe is moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, Smith in his research has focused on millennials and Generation Z, but I can tell you, as a middle-aged man raised in the 1970s, I grew up on the Southern white, conservative Protestant version of MTD. How good of God to believe in all the things that Southern white Protestant conservatives believed in, we thought. Moralistic therapeutic deism simply is what passes for popular Christianity of all kinds. Over the past few years of my travels to speak at Catholic and evangelical colleges and universities, professors and campus ministers have verified this sad fact. I'll tell you a little story. At the beginning of 2017, I went to speak at an evangelical college in the Midwest, a conservative evangelical college. And in one of my talks, I gave three lectures, and one of them I talked about the importance of establishing disciplines in our spiritual lives, prayer disciplines and others, fasting disciplines, etc. At the end of the lecture, we had Q&A. A young student there, a young woman, stood up in the back, raised her hand, and said, "Sir, I don't understand what you mean about disciplines. Why isn't it enough to love Jesus with all our hearts, like our parents taught us?" I said to her, "Well, of course we have to start with loving Jesus with all our hearts, but that love has to take some forms to keep us steady, even when we don't feel that emotion. We have to, because love is an act. It's not just an emotion. There will be times in our lives when we're not feeling that emotion, but if we practice these disciplines, that will keep us anchored in the gospel and in the love of Christ that will carry us through." That's the sort of thing I told her. She just looked at me and she didn't understand what I was saying. After the lecture was over, I spoke to one of the professors who told me that the point of view expressed by this young undergraduate is the point of view of 99% of the students in this university. He said they come to us here at the college out of church youth group culture, which is all about emotion, all about how Jesus is my best friend, and so on. He said they get here to the school and they're living in kind of a bubble around other evangelical students who have had the same experience. But when they get out into the world and they find their faith seriously challenged, especially when someone tells them, "What you Christians believe is really mean," he said their faith falls apart because they have not developed the intellectual understanding of the faith to be able to defend their faith, but even more so because they've not developed the sort of disciplines, prayer disciplines, scripture reading disciplines, fasting disciplines, and so forth, that would anchor them in practice, that would keep them strong. That was really, really telling to me, that here I was in a conservative evangelical college and finding that out about the students. Let me be as clear as I possibly can. Moralistic therapeutic deism is the last phase before total apostasy. This past summer, the former evangelical pastor, he's a superstar, Josh Harris, who wrote in the 90s, "I Kissed Dating Goodbye," he stated publicly that he had lost his faith. He had left the Christian church. He explained that he quit believing in normative Christian sexual morality, and he recognized that it was a fool's game to try to find biblical justification for the sexual revolution. So he gave up Christianity altogether. Now, I am grieved to hear about anyone's apostasy, but I respect that man's intellectual integrity. He did not try to rationalize his falling away from the gospel by embracing the MTD of progressive Christianity. I believe, though, that more and more young Christians will follow him out of the church entirely. I spoke recently to a dear church friend who told me that this is exactly what is happening to Generation Z members of his own theologically conservative parish. As I mentioned earlier, social science research is telling us that Christianity is an absolute free fall among Americans under the age of 45. It's not only happening here in America, by the way. If you're like me, a child of the Cold War, you think of Poland, the homeland of Pope John Paul II, a canonized saint, as a bastion of Christian piety in a godless continent. It's certainly true that Poland is much more observant than any other country in Europe, but there are massive cracks in the facade of Fortress Poland. I made a research trip there this summer and was shocked by what I discovered. Huge numbers of young Catholics, those born after the fall of communism, are leaving the church. Even millennial and Generation Z Catholics who adhere to the faith, who profess the faith in an orthodox way, told me that they're really afraid for the future. More than once I heard them say that they believe what happened to Ireland is going to happen to Poland within 10 or 20 years. Now, the institutional church, I learned, is in denial about this crisis. This is what they told me. One veteran priest, a priest who's closer to my age than the young, he asked to meet with me and told me that in his view, something like the Benedict Option is the only way forward for the faith in Poland. Now, this is Poland. On one of my first days in the country, a young Polish Catholic in Warsaw told me for the first time that he thought Poland was going to be like, in 10 years, it's going to be like Ireland is today, a great spiritual graveyard of the Christian faith. I found that hard to believe, but as I traveled around talking to more and more young Catholics to see if they agreed with that apocalyptic conclusion, every one of them said, yes, this is coming. We have to get ready for it. This, I think, is why the Benedict Option has done so well in Europe among Catholics in particular in their 40s and younger. They see what their parents and grandparents cannot. So how do we get ready for what's coming? We faithful Christians must fundamentally and radically change the way we live. The conformist, middle-class approach to the faith that many of us grew up with is worthless now. If you and your community are not actively and intentionally Christian in every aspect of your life and in a disciplined way, the faith is going to die. Simple as that. There's no alternative. I believe that Benedictine monasticism offers practical help for all of us Christians living in the world. This is why I call the choice, and it is a choice, facing all Christians today, the Benedict Option. The Benedict of the Option is Saint Benedict of Nursia, an Italian monk regarded by the Church as the founder of Western monasticism. Now, I want you to imagine that you're standing on the eastern outskirts of the city of Rome. It is around the year 500. We see a young man with his back turned to the city, hurrying away towards the forest, accompanied by his nurse. This young man, Benedict, born in the town of Nursia to Christian parents, had gone down to Rome to finish his education. The empire had fallen officially about 25 years earlier, and now the imperial capital was ruled by barbarian kings. The moral standards of the people in the city had collapsed. The young man saw his fellow students falling into the world's corruption, and he feared that if he stayed in Rome, the same thing would happen to him, that he would lose God and therefore his immortal soul. So on this day, the day he decided to leave the city, Benedict left everything behind him, and he didn't know what the future would hold. All he knew was that if he stayed in Rome, he risked losing his faith. Now, Benedict eventually moved into a cave in Subiaco to fast, to pray, to read the scriptures, and to wait for the Lord to tell him what to do. After 3 years, Benedict emerged from the cave, and he was known as had spiritual authority. He went on to found monasteries, which he called schools for the service of the Lord. Eventually, he wrote his famous rule, which was meant for laymen who wanted to live in Christian community, something I did not realize. St. Benedict, as far as we know, was never ordained a priest. He remained in the lay state, though a consecrated religious for the rest of his life. The rule of St. Benedict is short and simple, but it is one of the most influential documents of Western civilization. Why? Because the Benedictine monks saved our civilization. During the early medieval period, the Benedictine monasteries scattered across Western Europe like stars in the sky were centers of prayer, of learning, and of light in a very dark time. The monks kept the cultural memory of the West alive in their libraries, in their scriptoria. In the ruins of empire, they laid the groundwork patiently for the rebirth of civilized life. Now, let's be clear about one thing. St. Benedict did not set out to save civilization. He did not set out to make Rome great again. He only wanted to be faithful to God and to live in a community where he could be formed and to teach others how to live as serious Christians. When he died in the 4th decade of the 6th century, Benedict left behind a small number of monasteries in the vicinity of Rome. But he also left behind a way of living out the gospel that would gather the scattered spiritual energies of his time and place, store them up, and refine them. In his biography of St. Francis of Assisi, G.K. Chesterton said that St. Francis scattered what Benedict had begun storing up 6 centuries earlier. We are once again, my friends, living in an era of Christian gathering. We Christians today, I believe, are like the young Benedict, standing in what is left of the eternal city, faced with a life-changing decision. Do we dare to turn our backs on the world and set out into a deep forest of an uncertain future, searching for the Lord? Do we want God more than we want the world? If we say God, then we have taken the first steps in the Benedict option. But choosing God over the world has concrete consequences. It means recognizing that we no longer live in a country, America, that is a shining city on a hill, but one that has become for us a place of exile. It means living like St. Benedict on the outskirts of a society that is no longer home for us in a way it was home for our ancestors. But knowing that if we don't do this, if we don't embrace that exile and all that it means, our children will likely be assimilated into worship of the strange gods of the post-Christian world. The town where St. Benedict was born is called Norcia in modern Italian. In my book, Benedict Option, I write about the Benedictine monastery there, which was refounded around the turn of this century, by Father Cassian Folsom, an American Benedictine, and a handful of his followers. 3 years ago, when I made my first visit to that monastery, I met with Father Cassian and I told him about the Benedict option. I explained its basic points. First, that Christians must understand ourselves to be exiles in a world that is growing more and more hostile to the traditional, authentic Christian faith. Yet we must also be what Benedict XVI called creative minorities, learning how to live out that exile with joy. Second, that we must recover prayer and other spiritual disciplines rooted in the Church's traditions. We ordinary Christians have to work to make our faith more monastic. That is, we must live as if everything we do is a prayer, as if all things in life are manifestations of the Holy Spirit. Only in this way will we recover the sacred dimension of life that has been lost in modernity. Third, that we have to establish some form of common Christian life. We cannot survive this catastrophe alone. Fourth, that we must refuse what Pope Benedict XVI called the dictatorship of relativism, and instead educate ourselves and our children according to the Church's ancient teachings and the literary and cultural traditions of our civilization. To lose our cultural memory is to lose our identity. And fifth, that even though our vocation is to live in the world, not in monasteries, we must not allow ourselves to be assimilated by that world. Pope Francis is right. We Christians are called to share our faith and the love of Christ with the world, but we cannot give what we do not have. Father Cassian, the prior of the monastery, listened to me carefully. Then he told me that yes, Christians who fail to do some form of the Benedict Option will not have the strength to endure the darkness that is coming upon us with their faith intact. Father Cassian said to me, there's some Catholics who are already living the Benedict Option. They live on the other side of the mountains from our monastery in a city called San Benedetto del Tronto. You need to go visit them. So this is how I met my friend Marco Sermarini and his community, who call themselves the Thibodeaux. They're the best example that I've ever encountered of how the Benedict Option is supposed to work. They are a community of Catholic families, about 150 strong, living in a small city on the Adriatic coast. Now, there are critics of the Benedict Option who say that it's nothing more than running away from the world out of fear and anger. Now, if this is what you think, I urge you to travel to Italy and spend time with the Thibodeaux. These are active, committed Christian families, completely faithful to the traditional teachings of the Church, but also full of the joy of the gospel. The Thibodeaux, the name means the usual suspects in Italian. It's kind of a joke. They go to Mass in their parishes, but they have an active life as a Catholic community centered around their clubhouse called Santa Lucia, which overlooks the Adriatic. They study the Bible together, they pray together, they share meals, they make pilgrimages, especially to the monastery in Norcia. They grow a community garden. They started a Catholic school, the Scuola G.K. Chesterton. They serve the poor. And they're totally countercultural, following Pope Benedict's call to be creative minorities in this post-Christian world. Marco and his friends from university started the Thibodeaux in the 1990s, when they all grew dissatisfied with the shallow Catholicism that is standard in modern Italy. They sought a more radical way to serve Jesus in the Church. What Marco and his friends found is that everything they needed to live together as faithful Christians had been right in front of them all along. These are things that were hidden from view by modernity, and unfortunately, as Marco says, by people, by priests and others in the Church that put them all away, that hid them away from Catholics today. Marco told me, quote, "We invented nothing. We discovered nothing. We are only rediscovering a tradition that was locked away inside an old box. We had forgotten." The future of Western Christianity is being decided in communities of true believers like the Thibodeaux. True, they are in some sense stepping aside from the world, leaving the world, as St. Benedict walked away from Rome. But symbolically speaking, they are also going to the cave in Subiaco to put their spiritual roots down deep. They don't stay in the cave living as hermits, but rather they go back out into the world to share the Lord's gifts, because they are laymen. Anybody is welcome to come there to their community. They have outreach to people all the time. But when people come to that community, they know that they are coming to a community that knows what it's about and insist on living according to certain practices and certain standards. They're not going to accommodate themselves to the world. And as I said, these are really joyful people. They're Orthodox Catholics, but they're not angry about it. This is where I think the G.K. Chesterton part comes in. The Thibodeaux are exactly what you would expect to find in a Christian community that lives by a spirit that is both Benedictine and Chestertonian. The Benedict Option is not only about our own survival as Christians. This is about the future of humanity. If we are going to be for the world as Christ meant for us to be, then we're going to have to spend more time away from that world in deep prayer and fellowship and serious spiritual training. Again, my friends, we Christians cannot give the world what we do not have. Modernity has scattered our spiritual forces. Now is a time for gathering them in. Let me dwell on this point for a moment. Some critics, usually people who have not read my book, insist that I'm calling on Christians to run away from the world and build bunkers in the mountains. Not true. Fake news. We lay Christians are not called to be monks or nuns. I am saying that if we Christians are going to be faithful to our Lord in this post-Christian Babylon, then we have to live in ways that form us as faithful Christians. In other words, if we're going to be Christ for the world, then we have to spend more time away from that world and with our Lord. I explain it to people like this usually. I believe that as exiles from the modern world, we Christians are called to live by the word that the Lord gave to the Hebrews in their Babylonian exile in Jeremiah 29. You know, we're called to put roots down, to take wives, to pray for the peace of the city. But we also have to understand that in light of the book of Daniel, and the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the three Hebrew men who were thrown into the furnace. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego served the king. You can't get more embedded into Babylonian society than being servants of the king. But when they were asked to and told to apostatize, to bow down before the idol, they chose the prospect of death rather than apostasy. We have to know ourselves, ask ourselves, what was it about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and the lives they lived every day as Hebrews faithful to the one true God in Babylon that gave them the courage as well as the presence of mind to realize that this was a line they could not cross and that they would rather die than betray God. So we live Jeremiah 29, but we have to live it as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did. That is what our calling has to be. The Benedict Option is not a magical formula. It's a way of living the Christian life in a post-Christian civilization. It's simply a call for the church to be the church under circumstances that it has not had to face since the early centuries of the faith. The Benedict Option is going to look different in different places. Christians who follow it will adapt to its principles to their local circumstances and within their own church tradition. The Benedict Option is going to look different for Anglicans in exurban Boston than it will for Catholics on a small city on the Adriatic. And that's fine. There is no formula for this. We're going to have to work this out for ourselves in community. We can't be rigidly nostalgic and think that if we can only recreate 1950s era Christianity, all will be well. That's a dead end. We have to be creative in our recovery of our roots. We must work together to imagine and to build a viable future for ourselves and for our children. The common goal for us has to be a radical search for holiness. Anything less than that will collapse into atheism. There is no other option. A modern Benedict saw all of this coming. In 1969, a young priest named Joseph Ratzinger made a kind of prophecy. Speaking to a German radio audience, Father Ratzinger predicted that a severe crisis was coming and was already upon the Catholic Church that would destroy much of the Church's wealth and power. The Church would become smaller, but those who remained would be the seed of renewal. Father Ratzinger said, quote, "The future of the Church can and will issue from those whose roots are deep and who live from the pure fullness of their faith. The future of the Church, once again, as always, will be reshaped by saints, by men, that is, whose minds probe deeper than the slogans of the day, who see more than others see because their lives embrace a wider reality," unquote. That man, Joseph Ratzinger, was a prophet, and not just for the Catholic Church, for every Christian church in this world. And the saint he chose for his papal namesake, Benedict of Nursia, shows us in his rule both how to survive in this new dark age and also how to be a true light to the world in it. So think again about St. Benedict standing on the border of the cities of Rome. Was he an optimist? Certainly not. He saw the corruption everywhere, and he did not want to lose his soul. But St. Benedict had hope in God. He turned his back on the world and set his face on a search for the Lord. Through his act of hope, through his renunciation, through his saying no to the world and yes to God, Benedict opened the door for a great and glorious renaissance of faith and the restoration of the world. As the empire around us falls into ruin, we Christians today await a new and doubtless very different St. Benedict. I invite you to consider, you sitting here in this room today, in this church today, to consider that maybe you are the one the Lord has sent to us for a time like this. I want to tell you something about this new book I'm working on, which I think of as the next step in the Benedict Option project. It's about the coming of what I call soft totalitarianism in our own society. The idea came to me a few years ago when I started hearing from immigrants to America who had grown up under Soviet-style communism, either in the Soviet Union or in one of its Eastern European satellites. They tell me that they are seeing some of the same things that they escaped from arising here in America. A lot of it has to do with political correctness, but that's not all. In my research for the book, I've taken a deep dive into the history of 20th century totalitarianism, both the Nazi kind and the communist kind. It's deeply disturbing to see how much we in America today have in common with 20th century societies that succumbed to totalitarianism. We don't have time to get into it today, but let me just tell you that radical loneliness, social disintegration, and the loss of a belief in God and in transcendent standards had a lot to do with what came upon those societies. And there's this. The great scholar of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, says that pre-totalitarian societies are full of people who tell themselves that it could never happen here, that people like us would never fall for something like that because it violates common sense. Well, this past summer, a very minor Hollywood celebrity, Mario Lopez, said it seemed like a bad idea to him for adults to let their 3-year-olds decide whether they are male or female. That celebrity faced an avalanche of condemnation and quickly apologized for his bigotry. It remains to be seen whether or not the guy will still have a career after this. You might say, who cares about a small-time Hollywood celebrity, right? But don't minimize it. I hear every single day from college professors, school teachers, and Christians within major corporations who are facing exactly this kind of thing. It's spreading faster than many of us think, and it's all handwriting on the wall. When I was here in Massachusetts this past winter, speaking at a Catholic school fundraiser, I heard stories from people that beggared belief, from Boston area Christians about what they have to go through living here in a state that is aggressively post-Christian. The accounts they gave me about what they're seeing with their own eyes and living through in their own lives made it clear that the persecution of faithful believers has begun here in this state, and it will not stay contained here. 2 days ago, a federal judge in Michigan issued an important ruling for religious liberty. The state had passed a ban on Christian adoption agencies that refused to adopt babies out to same-sex couples. Well, the federal judge overturned the state's ban on working with Christian adoption agencies that refused to place kids with same-sex couples. In his ruling, he chastised the state's attorney general for her anti-Christian bigotry. He was very blunt. Now, this ruling is instructive in two ways. First, it revealed that federal judges who care about the First Amendment's religious liberty protections will probably be the last lines of defense for traditional Christians as this country becomes more and more post-Christian and indeed anti-Christian. Second, reading the public comments from the Michigan Attorney General that caused the judge to rebuke her highlighted the deep and abiding hatred of Christianity that we will see more and more of from political leaders, specifically when Christianity clashes with LGBT rights. In fact, the thing that sparked this new project of mine was what happened to Memories Pizza in Indiana. I don't know if you guys remember this, but in 2015, a couple of months before the Obergefell ruling, the state of Indiana tried to pass a state version of the Federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which would only have given a defense of sorts for religious people who were sued for discrimination. They would be able to cite the RFRA, as it was called, as a form of defense. It wouldn't guarantee that they would win, but it would give them some legal defense. Well, when the state tried to pass this version of the federal bill, a huge protest arose led by major corporations. This was the first time that big business had jumped in on the culture war, and they jumped in a big way, threatening to boycott the state if it passed this law. The media freaked out, even the local media there. A reporter for one of the TV stations went to a small-town pizza parlor, Memories Pizza, in Indiana, and owned by evangelical Christians. She asked the owners, would you cater a gay wedding? And they said, no, they wouldn't do it. And that report went viral. It made people all over the country call in death threats to the people who own this pizzeria, called for the mob to come in and burn them down. This was the sort of thing that that one of my readers, his mother, saw this and said, this is what it was like back home in Czechoslovakia when I was a kid. This woman had spent 6 years in a prison, a Czech prison, for her Christian faith under communism, and here she was in her 90s living in America, watching the mob descend on this Christian business and saying, this is what we lived with. We have to wake up in America. So by all means, let us fight this politically while we have the ability to do so. But the traditional Christians here in Massachusetts know how difficult that is in a state where a strong majority of the people have accepted secular liberalism. Massachusetts Christians are living out today what is going to be broadly true for all American Christians in the coming decades. At some point, though, political resistance will not be enough. And even when it can be mounted, political victories will be hollow if we have failed to pass the faith on to the next generation. Viktor Orban, the president of Hungary, has said, he's a Christian, he has talked about the limits of politics in these matters. He said, I, as a politician, can give people things, but I can't give them meaning. In other words, our politicians can protect a space for the church in which the church can work, but they can't do the work of the church. That's on us. We have to prepare a real resistance movement right now and anticipate that someday we might have to be underground. And so here's why I bring this up in connection with the Benedict Option. I've been traveling this year and working on this book project to the former communist countries, talking to dissidents and others who tried to resist communism. I'm trying to figure out what we Christians living in freedom can learn from their experiences. In Slovakia, the anti-communist resistance was the underground Catholic Church. I met men who went to prison for their faith and others who risked prison to keep Christianity alive under the communist yoke. I learned that in Slovakia, the resistance there began in 1943, 5 years before communism came to power, thanks to the work of a Croatian Jesuit named Kolakovic, Tomislav Kolakovic. Father Kolakovic arrived in Slovakia just ahead of the Gestapo, who was searching for him because he was trying to organize Catholic resistance to the Nazis in Zagreb in Croatia. So he went to Slovakia and hid there and told the Catholic laity in Slovakia that the war was going to come to an end someday, the Nazis were going to lose, but Slovakia was going to fall under communist rule. He told the believers that they had better prepare themselves for persecution. Father Kolakovich founded Catholic prayer and study groups all over the country so people could deepen their knowledge of the faith and their commitment to the Lord and build these bonds among the communities. And that would have helped things had Slovakia not fallen under communism. But 5 years, sure enough, 3 years after the war ended, the country did become communist. Those prayer and study groups that Father Kolakovich founded became the basis for the church's survival over the next 40 years. Father Kolakovich and his followers practiced a form of the Benedict Option. They built tightly knit, dedicated, small groups of the faithful who taught themselves how to suffer and witness for the faith. Because of them, the church survived in Slovakia and is one of the strongest churches left in Europe today. Father Kolakovich had 3 basic principles that he taught to his followers: see, judge, and act. By see, he meant that they needed to be observant to the events in the world around them. By judge, he meant that they should discern the meaning of those events in prayer, contemplation, and in discussion with other believers. And by act, he meant that Christians should make a firm decision to do something about it. My friends, I feel strongly today that we Christians have to read the signs of the times and prepare ourselves not only as St. Benedict would have done to live faithfully in a time of dissolution and chaos, but also as Father Kolakovich would have us do. I'll end with a story about Norcia, St. Benedict's hometown. The monks there in the monastery had been living there since the beginning of the turn of this century. They refounded the monastery after 210 years. Napoleon closed it down and sent the monks away. But Christianity, monastic Christianity, rose again around the year 2000 there. And at the beginning of the summer of 2016, an earthquake hit in that region. Cracks were found in the walls of the basilica and the monastery. The monks knew they had to move out, that it was unsafe to stay in that monastery because they could look at the walls and see the cracks. But they didn't abandon the monastery or monastic life. They just set up tents outside the walls of the town and resumed their ordinary monastic routines, living by the rule. Because of that, they were not at morning prayer in the basilica on the morning of October 30th, 2016, when the biggest earthquake to hit Italy in 30 years struck 6 miles north of Norcia. It brought the basilica falling to the ground, this medieval basilica. There was nothing left but rubble. All those monks would have died there in prayer had they not heeded the signs of the times, of their times, and moved to tents outside the town. The monks there today, they live in a monastery that they've rebuilt on the side of a mountain overlooking Norcia. They look down at the ruins of their basilica and monastery and see in that a sign of where the Western church is and Western Christianity is today. They believe that the only faithful response they can give is to keep living the rule out, keep praying, keep building each other up and the pilgrims who come to visit them spiritually, and trust in God to work in the long term to renew the church. But the lesson I take from them is when you see cracks in the wall, get out of the basilica before it falls in your head. Don't abandon the Lord or the way of life. Find a way to live on the outskirts of the town where you're not going to be crushed when the whole thing falls in. I think that is a metaphor for how we're called to live. My sense of the Benedict Option is much more like that of Marco Sermarini, the joyful Chestertonian, than it is of Father Kolakovich. But we can't be naive about what the future might bring. On my first visit to San Benedetto del Tronto, when I first met him, Marco said to me, quote, "I don't know what's going to happen next in life, but in the meantime, we have to fight for the good. The possibility of saving the good things in the world is only that, a possibility. We have to take the chances we have to set a rock in the earth and keep the rock steady." Through the Benedict Option, we can recommit ourselves to the faith. we can recover truth, we can recover meaning, we can recover purpose and solidarity and identity. Who knows? I might be wrong about all of this, but if I am, then you tell me, what else can we do? What we have been doing in this country does not work. We have not borne fruit, and we don't have unlimited time to work it out and to change course. We can't keep our options open forever. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. We have time for questions and answers, right, Bishop? We do. So I'll count on you to keep track of time. But so does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes.
Let's make this microphone.
Oh, okay.
Rod, thank you so much.
Can you identify yourself?
I'm Pastor Peter Gregory. I'm a Lutheran Church Missouri Synod pastor in Westminster, Massachusetts, 50 miles west of Boston. And I was moved from Indiana in the spring of 2015, so I remember very vividly the things going on there at that time. You said at the very end here that what we've been doing has not borne fruit, which got me thinking. I'm slightly younger, so I'm more a product of the 80s than the 70s. But some of the things you suggest as options or ideas for how to cultivate this community and culture among Christians are things that have been happening here in the United States for 20 years, 30 years or more, perhaps not at the same levels. And I'm talking about private schools, classical Christian schools, homeschooling. These things aren't necessarily new today. So if you've had a chance to reflect on it, have those things, as they were practiced in the 80s and the 90s, been successes or failures in nurturing the sort of Christian life that we need to have here in the United States?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And of course, I'm generalizing. When I say we have not borne fruit, there are these small communities that have done good things and do good things today. I'm speaking generally about the churches. The classical school movement is one of the most hopeful things that I've seen. I write about in the book how my wife teaches at a classical Christian school in Baton Rouge. My kids are educated there. And it turns out that these schools are turning out to be one of the only places that young people can become acquainted with the breadth of the Western cultural tradition. They're taught the Romans and the Greeks and on up to today in a Christian context, but they're exposed to it. And the goal is not to make us better Westerners. The goal is to make us more faithful to Jesus Christ. But this is our cultural legacy. This is our civilizational legacy. There are things we need to learn from our past because our ancestors matter. Some people have asked me why, what are Christians in other parts of the world that are not the West supposed to take from the Benedict Option? And I say to them, I wrote this as an American Christian for American Christians. I didn't even know this was going to be translated into European languages. But I'm really looking forward to the discussion today, to hearing from the Nigerian bishop about the challenges that Christians in that part of the world face from modernity too. Because modernity is something that goes around, that none of us can ultimately escape. There is no escape from modernity. The people, the brothers and sisters in Africa and in Asia may be later to get it than we're getting it, but they will get it. And I think little experiments like classical Christian schools and intentional communities, I write about some of them in the book, are a light. Cardinal Robert Sarah in the Catholic Church has written a new book that's out called For the Day is Long Spent. In it, he talks about, he's from Guinea, I believe. He talks about the importance of monasteries and monastic living to rebuild the late Christian faith today, creating these places of silence and contemplation in the noise of the modern world. These things is absolutely necessary for all Christians. So there are people like Cardinal Sarah and others who understand this. They have not been given the prominence they need in all the church traditions, and they've been drowned out by people often church bureaucrats who just want to go along to get along and don't want to trouble people to realize how radical the situation is. And I think and I hope that these leaders, lay leaders and clergy who work and monks who work in these small communities will get more attention, more positive attention as things continue to fall apart around us. But I tell you, last night I had dinner with Father Rice and Bishop Hiles, and at the end of it we were talking about the problems facing the church, but I said, you know, it's a pretty dark conversation about these problems, but I find these conversations more hopeful than the happy-clappy conversations among Christians who don't want to see the challenge, don't want to name the crisis, want to pretend like everything is just fine, when in fact it's falling down all around us. So that's probably a roundabout answer to your question, but I do think, yes, there are small groups that are doing pioneering things. I'm hearing about them all the time, groups that I didn't even know about when I wrote the book. They've been there all along, but nobody has seen them. They need to come into the center of our focus now. And some people are being inspired to start new groups because of the book. In Italy, there's a group of young Catholic families near Milan who read the book and they have small children. They're all in their late 20s, early 30s, and they want to live in a more intentional community, a lay community based around prayer and around spiritual disciplines and homeschooling. And they've talked to their bishop about it. He's given them their blessing. I'm so thrilled by this because it's going to take creative minorities like these young families who want something more than they're given and who see that passing on the faith to their children is simply not going to happen without radical steps like that. Somebody else? No questions?
Observation. So I appreciate the looking at success, and I guess part of what I'm wondering is it enough? So earlier on, you mentioned Joshua Harris, and if we think about him, here's a man who was homeschooled, and I know it's not just homeschooling, but I'm wondering, are the successes that we can see over 30 years of this sufficient to actually do what we want it to do? Because I myself was homeschooled, and I can see a lot of benefits and blessings and people who were well served by it, and I also see a number of others who are no longer practicing Christians. And so I'm wondering, seeing these communities develop is wonderful. Some of these things have been practiced for 30 years, and yet the successes have some successes and a lot of failures too.
Sure.
So.
Can you share with us why the people, what do you think homeschooling had to do with why people fell away from the faith?
I don't know that it had to do with why they fell away, but simply that it wasn't sufficient to keep them in the faith. My hunch is, and I was thinking about this sitting here, probably most of it has to do with family formation. And my sense is the same with classical Christian schools. You have a lot of people who are well served by those, but if the family formation isn't there, the chances of the children, I guess, staying in the faith are probably better than having been in other educational settings, but still not nearly as strong as if the family formation is there.
Oh, that's such an important point. There are no formulas here. I mean, I get so worn out by conservative, well-meaning conservative Christians I know who seem to think that if they just carry the right thoughts in their head, the right theological principles, and vote Republican and send their kids to a Christian school, that everything's going to work out. In the meantime, they're letting their little children have these things. Little children who are coming across pornography, hardcore pornography at the age of 9. And even if they didn't see this pornography, these devices are completely fragmenting community and fragmenting our ability to pay attention. Professors I talk to, and some of you who in the room may be college professors and may have seen this, they say that in the last 7 or 8 years, they've seen a dramatic change in the students' ability to focus. And this is all because this is the first generation that grew up with smartphones. So when I see Christian parents who think that they can just, having the right intentions and putting their kids in these in these schools, and that's going to take care of everything. It's not. You know, first of all, there are no absolute guarantees. Some of the most faithful Christian families I know have lost some of their kids to the faith because we have free will. You know, I think things like classical Christian schools or homeschooling, things like that are necessary when we can do them well, but they're not sufficient. Only the grace of God is sufficient. And if we allow our families to become places that are only notionally devoted to holiness, then we shouldn't be surprised when we fail. It is this is something that I've been talking to others in the classical Christian community, school community. I've heard that headmasters complain that most of the parents who send their kids to these schools are well-intentioned, but they don't really get the mission. Rather than trying to form their children as deeply faithful Christians in this time and place, they just want their kids to escape liberalism. And there's a very, very big difference in running away from liberalism and running towards the true, the good, and the beautiful. You know, and that, I think, is something I hear a lot of classical Christian educators saying is one of the biggest challenges they face, to educate the parents into the fact that radical living requires everybody having to change, including you and your family and the way you do things in your family. One of the most difficult things I've found in talking to people about this is to tell parents that you're going to have to risk being unpopular with your children and your children being unpopular in their community. I know church-going conservative people who will skip church on Sunday morning, skip Mass, skip the liturgy because their kids have a sports game. Your kids know. Your kids know that sports is more important to you than the faith, if that's what you do. I knew it myself when I was a teenager. I went up to boarding school for my last 2 years of high school. I came home from school for Easter break, and I told my parents that I wasn't sure I believed in God anymore. My dad said, well, you're going to church on Easter Sunday with your mom, no matter what. I said, well, what are you going to do? Well, he was going turkey hunting. I said, I'll tell you what, if I won't give you the business about turkey hunting, if you'd let me skip church, I promise I'll sit at home and read the Bible for an hour. And he made that deal. And I kept my end of the bargain. I read the Bible for an hour, and he went turkey hunting, but I knew right then and there never to take anything my dad said about the faith seriously again. Now, I don't mean to throw my dad under the bus. You know, years later, he's passed away, and he came back to Christ before he died, thank God. But as a parent myself of 3 children, I learned that I cannot expect my children to do things that I'm not willing to do myself. And my wife and I have tried to set a good example for our kids and to realize that forming Christian children, that our home is like a domestic monastery where every one of us has to be on a constant pilgrimage to greater unity with Christ. And it's not simply a place where we tell the kids, you do this, and everything's going to work out. Somebody else? Yes, in the back. Where's the mic?
So how would you distinguish between what you're proposing and just a thriving church community? In other words, is what you're saying basically an exhortation from the pulpit to be better Christians? Like we often hear, every Sunday. So what is that essential distinction between the Benedict Option and just a thriving church with, good ministries or something?
Yeah, no, thank you for the question. The question is, what's the difference between a thriving church community and the Benedict Option? You've hit on it right there. In the book, there's a quote from my friend Leah Labresco-Sargent, who said, all you're asking people to do, all you're asking is for the church to be the church. But if you don't call it this, if you don't label it this, people aren't going to do it. And I think she was onto something important there. I believe that's all the Benedict Option is a call on the church to be more spiritually disciplined, to be more intentional about its communal bonds, nurturing its communal bonds, and to be more faithful in its witness. But I think one essential difference, though, is the diagnosis of the times. There's never a time in the history of the church when we weren't called to be more spiritually disciplined, more faithful, to deepen our conversion, and to love our brothers and sisters in the church. That's just basic Christianity. The basic difference in the Benedict option, though, is I'm trying to call people to see how serious the times are, and that we need this more than ever. We have been living in a culture that has been Christian for 1,500 or more years, and now we are not anymore as a culture. There are Christians in our culture, but Christianity is no longer the story by which our Western civilization understands itself. If you see the crisis in those terms, if you can look at the numbers of people falling away from the church, especially the younger generations falling away from the church, that will, or it should be, a strong impetus to do the things that we ought to have been doing all along, but you do it in a crisis mode. The difference between the Hebrews worshiping in Jerusalem and the Hebrews worshiping in Babylon is stark. I think that we have gone metaphorically from Jerusalem to Babylon, and that means that if we don't keep up our traditions and keep up our spiritual disciplines in a very serious and sustained way, even to the point of suffering for them, then we're not going to make it. We're going to be assimilated. Bishop Hiles was talking about how reading the book caused the scales to fall from his eyes. I mean, here's a man who's been a faithful churchman for decades, but the book helped him to see the roots of this crisis, this anti-Christianity, the spirit of Antichrist that is moving in the world, and helped him to see what we Christians need to do, how we need to change our way of life to meet the seriousness of our times. So yeah, I'm just calling on the church to be the church, but to be the church in a context in which our own survival as a church is at stake. The Lord promised that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church, but he didn't promise that the gates of hell would not prevail against it in North America, in the United States. That depends on our willingness to open our hearts and change our lives in a radical way, to open our hearts to the Holy Spirit, to push for deeper conversion, and not simply an emotional or intellectual conversion, but a conversion in our practices. In the book, I talk about Robert Louis Wilken, one of the great living historians of the early church, an essay he wrote in First Things magazine in 2004 called The Church as Culture. You can read this online. Wilken talked about how he had been in Europe doing research or on vacation or something, and how despite having all these incredibly beautiful churches and monasteries and all the physical signs of Christianity everywhere around him, the memory, the living cultural memory of Christianity had dissipated among most modern Europeans. That led Wilken to say that the protection, the recapturing and the protection and the passing on of spiritual and moral discipline of traditional Christianity within the church today is more important even than evangelizing. Because, in other words, we have to evangelize and disciple our own people, because we're losing it even within the precincts of the church itself. I think that's simply true. I don't see how it can even be denied.
I just wanted to say what the heck is this? Some positive things that are happening. The young people, like we all made our Socratic turn maybe sometime in our life and changed our direction. Like we became Catholic and now I don't know, it's hard to stay Catholic, but kids are putting phones in lockup, and it may be in comedy shows, bars, and plays, but they're purposely putting their phones away as a temptation, and they get more conservative as they make families. I do have a question at the end of this. And then there's Jordan Peterson, who acts as if God exists, and he has his biblical lectures, and he refuses to say he's any particular denomination, which I think is good, but he's a big hope, and a lot of people are, getting onto him. And as far as short attention spans, kids are watching 3-hour videos on YouTube on serious matters regularly, and there are, people like Ben Shapiro and Dave Rubin who have dedicated followers. And the young are more conservative than the prior generation, and my concerns that maybe you can address, there is a pushback against pornography among men who are, YouTube commentators. And I'm worried about two things: contraception and debt in education. And contraception allows women to, really screw up their lives with massive debt. And then the minute they turn 30, they're loosed on the world and they have to be a doctor or a lawyer. And who's going to marry them with all that debt? And I guess that's enough.
Okay. Thank you for that. About family formation, there's a book by Mary Eberstadt, who's a friend of mine and a faithful Catholic and a scholar writing in Washington. And she wrote a book called How the West Lost God. I think that's the name of it. But she had a new theory of secularization she offers. And her theory is basically this, that we learn how to be believers within our families. When families break up, as they have done in our civilization since the sexual revolution, they've been breaking up at astonishing rates, that makes it harder for people to believe in God. And I won't get into Mary's argument here, but I commend that book to you because she draws a really close connection between family formation and family sustenance and the ability to even know who God is. Similarly, a few years ago, I was giving a talk at an evangelical college in Michigan, and I was talking before my speech. I was having dinner with some of the professors there, and asking them about the challenges they see among their students. One of the men said that he thinks the greatest challenge they'll face is family formation. That struck me as odd. It shows what I know. I said, but this is a conservative evangelical college. Why would this be a problem? Why wouldn't these kids be able to marry and form families? And he said, because most of them have never seen a healthy family, a stable family. I looked around the table and all of the men shook their heads and said, yeah, that's true. And this is something that, to me, I had a stable family growing up. I have a stable family now. Most of the people in my very tight bubble live in stable families. But that's not the way the world is today. And this is something that we have to pay a lot more attention to, I think, as a theological problem, not just a moral and a social problem, but as a theological problem, how difficult it is to form and sustain families in this culture. I'm glad for Jordan Peterson. I think he has done a lot of good, and it's strange how I've seen some of his lectures, and I'm not a fan in the sense that I don't watch them all the time, but I've liked what I've seen. But when I talk to young people, especially young men, Jordan Peterson, this maybe not a believer, is speaking more to the moral and spiritual formation of young men in our culture than the church is. That shouldn't be. Rather than trying to tear down Jordan Peterson, as some people in the church are doing, we ought to learn from him and see what is he doing right. Why is he able to speak with authority into the lives of young people who are lost and give them hope and direction and he doesn't even have the gospel, when we who have the gospel can't. About contraception, that's not a topic that I can speak to, but I will say this. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, there is a very strong teaching that the way to convert the world is to live faithfully and boldly as a Christian. One of our saints, modern saints, says, acquire the Holy Spirit and thousands around you will be saved. What he means by that is when you live out, when you're completely sold out to the Lord, you live out joyfully as a Christian and sacrificially as a Christian, and people see the fruits of that in your life, they're going to want to know what's happening with this person. Why are they living that way? What accounts for their joy and their stability and the order and peace in their lives? And that's when we can reach out to them and tell them how. Certainly it comes from the Lord first and foremost, but also ways of living out, including the matter of having big families, of refusing contraception. But I think that you're never going to be able to go to people in this culture and beat them over the head with what we believe to be true and expect them to change their ways. We have to be very, very careful and very wise in the way we evangelize. Because of my own messy spiritual journey, I was a Catholic for 13 years and then lost my ability to believe as a Catholic because of my reporting on the abuse scandal. And that had a lot to do with my own failures as a Christian, my own thinking that as long as I had all the thoughts clear in my head, had all the catechism straight in my head, that my faith could withstand anything. It's not true. I should have been doing a lot more prayer and a lot more living out my faith in concrete ways. That might have made me stronger. I was determined after I lost my Catholic faith, when I became Orthodox, I was determined not to be the kind of intellectually arrogant Orthodox that I was as a Catholic. I can't keep the bishops or the priests from malfeasance, but I can protect myself and protect my own family, and that includes deepening my relationship with the Lord in ways that I had been ignoring as a Catholic. But I have felt that I don't have any authority anymore, given how messy my path has been, to tell people, you ought to become a Catholic, you ought to become an Orthodox. Instead, what I've tried to do is to speak generally about the cultural crisis we're in, but also to make my own life and the life of my family speak for what, in my case, the Orthodox spirituality, Orthodox Church has done for us. There are some people who can speak with more authority about their particular tradition, but for me, those that I myself pay more attention to are those who show fruits in the way they live, in the peace in their heart, and the sense of the Holy Spirit that I can see in them. Those are the ones that speak to me and speak convincingly to me, not the ones who make the best arguments. Somebody else? One more question. Yes. Sorry. You had the mic.
I have a question and a mic. Both. So maybe after me, him. Okay. I come from Africa. Particularly, I come from Kenya. We got the Bible from the West. We translated it. Our preachers there preach it very hard. They pray very hard. They sing very hard. Sometimes you might think the heavens will open. However, there are a few things which we have noticed. Because, as I said, everything came from the West, so we trust the West up to now. Certain things have come from the West, which our people have been trying to check in the Bible and have difficulty in finding them. But yet, the preachers and the priests from the West keep on insisting on some of them. I'll mention two. I think it has been discussed before, but since you are here, I would just like to mention things like same-sex marriages. They don't accept it at all. That might threaten also to break the church. And then there's something else which comes into politics. I don't think it's very right for a church to say, let's move this side. Let's do this, let's support this, let's do this and that. You can talk to the people, let the individuals themselves decide. But we see it here in America in politics. Certain people say, we shall support so-and-so. So when people look at some of those things, they really hurt. And back in Africa, our churches, big churches like Catholic, like Anglican, some of them are breaking down. People are going solo. Individuals are starting up as pastors because of some of these things which they find abominable. So I don't know what you'll have to say for that.
Oh, thank you for that. You know, I give thanks for the church in Africa because I see the faith being preserved there in ways that we are losing, in ways you just mentioned. The whole question of same-sex marriage and homosexuality is tearing the church in the West in half, and I share your view too that this is completely unacceptable. But it has been accepted by a lot of Protestant churches in this country. Many Catholic churches are doing it now, even though it's against the teaching of the church. And we're starting to hear sounds in the Orthodox churches. Some people, some more liberal scholars, want there to be dialogue about it. Well, there can't be dialogue on this. We know where that leads. So I'm glad that Africa is taking the stand that it's doing. And I think that people in the West, especially in the Anglican and the Catholic churches, have to understand that if you are a truly Catholic church, if you're a global church, that what you do in the West will affect people in Africa. I remember years ago reading about how Archbishop Akinola in Nigeria was talking about how difficult it is in his country to present the gospel in the face of Islam when the Muslims just have to point to how crazy the Episcopal Church and the Anglican Church in the UK is, how crazy they're going on sexuality. So I think that this is something that we in the West have to be more responsible about. But I think, too, that one thing we have to be careful of, too, in the West is idealizing the other. I mentioned earlier about Poland, how I always thought that Poland was this bastion of the faith in a godless continent. And then I go there and I realize that it's not what I thought it was, that it's a lot more complicated. In my own church here in this country, the Orthodox Church, a lot of Orthodox converts look at what's happening in Russia. The faith is coming back, the state supports the faith in a big way. They say Russia doesn't have the problems we do here. But if you talk to Russian Orthodox people who actually live and worship in Russia, they give you a very different picture. I've heard the same thing about Africa too, that the faith is very strong there in ways that we in the West need to learn from. But we shouldn't think of Africa as some sort of paradise. Africa has her own problems within the churches there, which is just human. I think that what we should do, all of us Christians in Africa, in the US, in Europe, and everywhere, we should learn from the strengths of each other's churches, but also not idealize them as the answer. So many Christians in my circles say, well, Africa will have to come re-evangelize Europe, and that is how the re-evangelization of Europe will happen. I hope so, but we can't be the sort of people who think that everything is perfect in Africa, and that is actually a problem among some Western Christians who are disgusted with how weak our own leadership is. We think it's not a problem in Africa. I think that's just not true. About politics, I think you're absolutely right. Our churches have become too politicized. The media like to think that this is only a problem of the religious right with Trump. But in fact, in the year 2010, a scholar, a political scientist at Harvard, Robert Putnam, and a colleague of his, David Campbell, at University of Notre Dame, they published a big, thick book called American Grace that gathered in all the studies of the church life in America to see what it is Americans believe. They found, even though I know Putnam is himself a liberal, they found that, in fact, progressive churches are much more politicized than theologically conservative churches. That was a surprising thing to me because I'm used to hearing the media talk about how this is only a problem of the religious right in conservative churches. In fact, it is a problem of the American church, all American churches. And I think it's a really fine line to walk between recognizing that the Christian faith is not just a private thing, it has public consequences. It matters whether or not our country supports abortion. It matters whether or not our country supports religious liberty. But politics cannot be the ultimate goal of churches. And I think that distinction gets confused in a lot of churches who think that we're just the Republican Party at prayer or the Democratic Party at prayer. No. Our faith does have political consequences, but the church itself has to stay focused on our Lord and our conversion, our ongoing conversion, not the worldliness of political gain. Thank you for your questions, everybody, and we'll be around all day, and I'll be happy to talk with you privately.
I would ask that Deacon John tell us what we will do now about homes. And as you're going, see those, if you have questions or concerns, those people who have a red lanyard around their neck are members of the vestry, and they can probably deal with most of your questions and concerns. Deacon John.
Lunch is being served in Parish Hall. You will proceed through the doors in the rear and walk down the walkway and exit Parish Hall through the double doors